In this Lenten season, oh God, we give you thanks for the opportunity to reflect more fully on Jesus, his walk to the cross, and what that means for us. Help us not to shy away from that. Give us understanding and a desire to follow Jesus. And we ask this in his precious name. Amen. I was having a conversation with my daughter Michelle a couple of weeks ago. The place she works, they have a consultant that's there to try to get things working more efficiently, more effectively, and so it was her turn to meet with the consultant, and she spent some time and she just wanted to get to know Michelle, so they're just sharing, and she's trying to find out that Michelle had gone to Yale Divinity School. She said, "Oh, so you're a Christian?" And she said, "I'm a Quaker." And she said, "No, I wouldn't tell many people this, but I have an app that sends me 5 messages a day reminding me about death." She said, "Most people wouldn't understand that." And it's quite interesting. So she told me the name of the app. The app is called We Croak. WECroak. There's a picture of a frog on the front of it. I would have downloaded it, except it was 99 cents. I didn't want to spend all that money. And so there were a couple of examples. So one of the examples is this: people are born soft and weak; they die hard and stiff. How's that for motivation? Here's number 2. One must live as if it were forever, and as if one might die each moment, always both at once. And then the app says at the bottom, says in Bhutan, they say contemplating death 5 times a day. Now, I'd have to say that that's probably not the way most Americans think. I think we live in a culture that's death-phobic, actually. And but it's interesting because the very central symbol of our faith, what you see hanging on the wall there, is an instrument of death. The very center of our faith, the very central symbol of our faith, is an instrument of death. Fleming Rutledge, Episcopalian pastor and scholar, writes, "It is typical of American Christianity, as of the American culture as a whole, to push the cross out to the margins because we prefer a more upbeat and triumphal form of proclamation and practice." And so the Lenten season, though, however, is part of the church year in which we have the opportunity. In fact, we are encouraged to take death seriously, Christ's death seriously, and what it means to follow Jesus. He said in our text, "Take up my cross and follow me." So we have a part of the church calendar that's really invites us into a very countercultural act. And so this morning I would like for us to spend a little bit of time on this thought. Text, of course, is Mark 8:34-35. It's the very kind of center of Mark. It's right at the pivot point in the Gospel of Mark. From here on in, it's very clear that Mark is showing Jesus going to the cross. And I think the central part that I want to focus on is Mark 8:34-35, and I want to just read it in another translation. It says this: "Then, calling the crowd to join his disciples, he said, 'If any of you wants to be my follower, take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it.'" I especially want to zero in on verse 34. And sometimes when you're doing a study in Scripture, it's very helpful to look at different translations or paraphrases that help bring out the meaning. So I have 4 different translations or paraphrases that I want to read. The first one comes from the New Living Testament. It says this: "If any of you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. The message is the next one. You need to fasten your seatbelt for this one. Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Don't you love those last two sentences? Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. The third one, and this comes from Contemporary English. No, this next one is from Phillips. It's a paraphrase. If anyone wants to follow in my footsteps, he must give up all right to himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And the last one is a Contemporary English Bible. All who want to come after me must say no to themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. So a lot of times we say take up the cross. What does it mean? I think these passages can help because usually the first phrase in each of these sentences kind of defines what he's talking about. The one that's probably the most explicit is Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of the Message, saying, let me take the lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. That's what we're talking about. That's what it means to take up your cross. It's not about me. Now, let me, before I go further, say this. When we're talking about taking up your cross and following Jesus, we're not talking about being a doormat. Jesus was anything but a doormat. He had more courage than anyone I know. He spoke the truth to authorities. He lived it. He didn't back down. Jesus was not a doormat. So we're not including in this the idea, pick up your cross and follow me. I'll let people do whatever they want to do with me, and I'm not going to try to do anything. It doesn't mean allowing people to abuse you, or you need to take appropriate action. So we're not talking about that kind of thing, but we're talking about having an attitude of mind in which we are willing to follow Jesus no matter what the consequences are of that decision. To help bring this out, I want to just contrast it a little bit. A number of years ago, the Dalai Lama was being interviewed with the New York Times, and in that interview, he says, they asked why he's so popular, and he responded, we all desire happiness and wish to avoid suffering. Right? This is exactly the opposite of Eugene's Peterson, where he said we embrace suffering. And then Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a very well-known Buddhist author, when he was interviewed with Newsweek a number of years ago, he made this comment on the crucifixion. He said, the crucifixion is a very painful image to me. It does not contain joy or peace, and this does not do justice to Jesus. Now, there's quite a contrast and understanding of who Jesus is and what he is calling us to. Now, Christianity does not recommend suffering for its own sake. We're not masochists, okay? Let's be clear about that. We're not supposed to seek suffering. Absolutely not. In fact, it's part of a Christian's task in the world to alleviate as much suffering as possible. But by no stretch of the imagination, however, could Christianity ever be said to recommend the avoidance of suffering in the cause of love and justice. And you can think of this in terms of Martin Luther King Jr. In his call, you think of like what the Dalai said and what Thich Nhat Hanh said, and then you contrast that with Martin Luther King, who summoned us to follow for redemptive suffering. A Christian is willing to experience, embraces suffering for the greater good of the kingdom of God in terms of following Jesus. We don't try to avoid it. Now I want to narrow down to the topic for today, and that is we're living into the cross of the title, dying to our expectations. All of us have expectations, correct? I don't think it's possible to be a human being without having expectations. We all have expectations. And we want those expectations to be filled. We have expectations about our family, about the members of our family, what they should do. We have expectations about our own life and the course it should take and the things that should happen to us. In every area, we have expectations. And when you really think about things, the reality is we have very little control in terms of living life. The amount of control we have to make our expectations fulfilled is really quite small. There are so many things that happen outside of our control that impinge on our expectations. It's as simple as I was talking with someone when they were saying, well, when I first got married, in my family, the father always took he did all the handiwork and he always took the garbage out. And when I got married, I had that expectation of my husband, but my husband didn't do that. And so they had to renegotiate what her expectations and who would do what. So it can happen in small ways like that, but not necessarily unimportant if it's small. But the fact is, we have our expectations. And depending on what happens, we can become very angry. We can become depressed. There's all kinds of things that we can do that will, when our expectations are not met. And so part of following Jesus is letting go of the expectations. I would say not having them. We all have expectations. That's normal. But I think we need to hold on to them loosely. We need to hold on to them loosely. I think of our epistle lesson is a great example. Some of you say, today or tomorrow we will go to some city. We will stay there a year, do business, and make money. But you do not know what will happen tomorrow. Your life is like a mist. You can see it for a short time, but then it goes away. So you should say, if the Lord wants, we will live and do this or that. So there is a way in which it leads us to have a much greater sense of humility, acknowledging that we aren't in control of so many things. So many things, and we, I think, are so easily deceived, we deceive ourselves to think that our expectations, that's what's going to happen. That's what should happen, and that's what better happen. Let's think of some biblical illustrations of this. I think when I was thinking of biblical illustrations, I was thinking of Moses. Moses' expectations were blown out of the water several times. First of all, he was raised in Pharaoh's house. He thought he was going to be on to some kind of great royal position. Maybe he would replace the Pharaoh. You know the story. He ends up killing an Egyptian who was beating one of the Jewish slaves, and then he has to flee. He has to get out of Dodge because the Pharaoh is after him and wants his life. So talk about an expectation blown out of the water. That was the expectation. So then he settles into another expectation. He's out in the wilderness. He's a sheep herder. He's minding his own business. He has no desire ever to see the Pharaoh go back to Egypt or to be involved politically in any way. And then there's the story of the burning bush, right? Actually, one of senior high fellowship asked the question, if you roasted a marshmallow in the burning bush, could you do that? Well, that's just an aside. That's totally tangential to this. But he didn't want to go back. And so God was saying, oh, well, you might not want to go back. I want you to go back. I have plans for you. I have expectations of you that you're going to do. You don't want to go, you're going. And if you know the story, I mean, he fought like tooth and nail to talk God out of doing this. And God was very persistent, and so once again, Moses' expectations were blown out of the water. biblical character that comes to my mind is Joseph. Joseph, the favorite son, multicolored coat. He was going to be he was dad's right-hand man. Things looked pretty rosy for him until his brothers got together, captured him, and threw him in a pit. They were going to kill him, but fortunately a caravan came by and they sold him as a slave. So here is the favored son of this wealthy patriarch who had big expectations for himself in the family. All of a sudden, expectations blown out of the water. So he's sold into slavery for years. He's a slave, then he's framed, it's trumped up, and then he ends up in jail, in prison, and he feels like he's forgotten until finally one day he's brought out and elevated. But the point of this is Joseph's expectations were blown out of the water. And it happens to us as well. If we're honest, I've known couples, they're looking for retirement, they can't wait, they've been planning for their retirement, they're going to go traveling, and as soon as one of them retires within a year, one of them contracts some terrible disease, cancer, or something like that. And so the spouse then, that spouse's job then is to take care of the spouse who's been afflicted. Talk about expectations that are totally blown out of the water. That happens not infrequently. You probably know couples like this. Another illustration of dying to our expectations. We need to hold on to them loosely. As James said, if God wills, I'll do this. I would like to do this, but not be demanding and expecting that this has to happen, that this must happen. In my own personal life, I think of, most of you know about Tyler falling out of the deer stand, breaking his back. I mean, it totally changed Michelle and Tyler's expectations in terms of what they were going to do. Tyler was a big huntsman, loved hunting, he was a woodsman, he knew everything about trees, would love to go, and that's all off the plate right now. Totally blown out of their water, and their life has totally changed. Beth and my life, we didn't expect that to happen at all. The other night I was talking with Michelle, and they live out in the woods. They live out in the woods, and they have a dog, and the dog took off, and there were a pack of coyotes in the woods, and they could hear them yelping. You know, the coyotes were yelping, and so she went out in the snow in her stocking feet to try to get him, calling him, and eventually he came back. I mean, he came back fairly quickly, fortunately. But as Michelle came back in, Tyler said to her, you know, it was really weird because I always felt like I would protect my family, and I can't protect my family right now. When I talked with him last night, he was saying, yeah, I want to get his permission to say that. He said, last night I was walking up the driveway. The driveway is probably about a half mile. I was walking up the driveway, and it just occurred to me that if anything happened to Sylvia, our granddaughter, who's a little over 1, if anything happened to her, it'd take me I couldn't help her. But talk about expectations being blown out of the water. And yet we are called to follow Jesus. And that means to follow Jesus wherever we're led, trusting that he will provide for us, that he will give us what we need, and also following Jesus in ways that bring honor to him. Sometimes you may end up getting fired from your job for doing the right thing. Losing your job is no fun. That's suffering. And so God is calling us, as we take up our cross, to die to our expectations. Hold them loosely. It's not that you ought not have them, but it's that we need to be able to let go of them. When circumstances change, or when we see injustice that's being done and God's calling us to do that, and we might be like Moses saying, oh, I don't want to get involved, I don't want to do that, this could be really bad. but that is what Jesus is calling us to. That's what it means to take up your cross and follow him. Take up my cross and follow me. And so, I'm not recommending that you buy the Wheat Croak app. I'm still debating whether I'm going to do that or not. But it's a good thing to remind ourselves that we are mortal. That we are mortal. There's the great verse in the Psalm 90. It says, "Teach us, O Lord, how short our lives really are, so that we may be wise." And so I would invite you in this Lenten season, as we contemplate what it means to take up the cross and follow Jesus, that we would meditate. We would allow thoughts of, what does it mean that I'm a mortal person, that I will die? What does that mean for the way I'm living my life right now? What does it mean to follow Jesus in that way? Because that's what it means to follow Jesus. Take up your cross, give up your expectations, and follow me.